It's the end of the Torah Devorah. Again, remember Kabbalistically what's going on. And again, I've said this a number of times, so let me just get my recorder here. 1 second. Yeah, so I've said it a number of times that people commonly say the Torah Devorah is about the Yud Gimel Midas of Rachamim. And once again, let me remind you that that statement is not complete in for two different reasons. Reason number one is that the Torah Devorah is not a direct commentary on the Yud Gimel Midas of Rachamim in the Torah, which is Hashem Kel Rachum B'Chanan. It is a commentary on the Yud Gimel Midas in the book of Micha, which actually the Navi does not directly correlate them, but the Mekubalim correlate the Yud Gimel Midas of Micha with the Yud Gimel Midas of Moshe. And you'll recall in the language of the Zayar, the Yud Gimel Midas of Micha are called Rachamim Elyonim. They are the roots of the Rachamim that's expressed in the Torah. Now that itself is a funny inversion, because you would normally assume that what's in the Torah is spiritually higher than what is in the Nevi'im. And yet, the Zayar HaKadosh says that the Yud Gimel Midas of Rachamim in Micha are the Shirish, are the heavenly roots of the Yud Gimel Midas of Moshe. Now, the way you understand that is that the Torah is that which applies in everyday life. So, basically, in Shamayim, the Midos exist in a very pure state. By the time they come to earth, they're intermixed with other things, so they're diluted a little bit. But as a result, the Yud Gimel Midas of Micha are Rachamim Elyonim. So that's the first point. The Torah Devorah is not a commentary on the Yud Gimel Midas of Moshe, but on the Yud Gimel Midas of Micha. But the second point is that the Torah Devorah is really about emulating all of the 10 Sfiros of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the highest of which is Keser. And the first chapter of the Torah Devorah, as well as the second chapter, which we haven't gotten to, is all about emulating Keser. And there'll still be another 9 Sfiros that one has to emulate. So really, the first parak of the Torah Devorah, which is by far is the most famous and the most studied part of the work, is only explaining how you emulate one of the 10 Sfiros of Hashem. And then we'll have the rest of the Sefer, which actually the truth is the first parak is as long as the rest of the Sefer. But Lamaisa, there are going to be 9 other Sfiros that you emulate as well. Right? So those are two reasons why the common statement that the Torah Devorah is about the Yud Gimel Midas of Rachamim is not completely accurate. So we're up to number 12 and 13. Again in the pasuk Mikel Kamocha. And it says, right, Titin Emes the Yaakov Chesed the Avram. Then it says, Asher Nishbata Lavoseinu, that you swore to our forefathers, Mimei Kedem, from ancient times. So number 12 is Asher Nishbata Lavoseinu, and number 13 is ancient times. Now again, be sure you understand that this is a chiddush in interpretation. This is not the Pashut Pshat. The Pashut Pshat of the pasuk that is Asher Nishbata Lavoseinu Mekedem is not a distinct midah. Meaning, you're saying give mercy to Avram, give chesed to Avram, give truth to Yaakov. Asher Nishbata Lavoseinu is simply saying because you made a shvuah to the Avos in ancient times. Meaning, it's not a separate midah of Rachamim. It is kind of a because, it's kind of a reason. But the Ramak, again based on the Zohar, is Mechadesh that Asher Nishbata Lavoseinu is a midah of Rachamim, and even Mimei Kedem, although Mimei Kedem is in the sentence structure, is simply saying, you swore to our forefathers in ancient times. The in ancient times is not a separate thing, and yet we're going to see that this is counted as midah number 13. So it's important to notice that sometimes the way the Ramak is explaining the words in the pasuk It is not the simple meaning of the pasuk. There are chidushim in the interpretation. Yeah.
How would you count it otherwise? How would you get to 13?
Well, you wouldn't, but once again, in terms of pshuto shal mikra, who says you got to get 13? In other words, Micha does not announce, I am now going to enumerate 13 midos. In other words, all of this comes from the Zohar saying there are 13 attributes in this pasuk. But all I'm saying is, al pi pshat, you don't have to make it 13. Yeah.
Can you say the same thing about the 13 midos from Moshe? That v'nakeh, I don't think is an attribute, it's an action. And also the first few words might ultimately be, right?
Well, you have similar, you may have some similar problems with Moshe, but on the other hand, Vinake is describing God's action of cleansing us, whatever that means, exonerating us, purifying us. So that could be described as Hashem's rachamim in, forgiving us. So I think you have less of a problem with the Yud Gimel Midas of Moshe than you have with Micha. So we're up to, so again, we're doing 12 and 13. Number 12 is Nishbata Lavoseinu. Number 13 is Mimei Kedem, a Chiddush. So what is Midah number 12? So the Ramak says, relatively straightforward as a Midah, and that is that even if a person is not worthy, and even if a person on his own does not deserve any of the rachamim that we've already discussed, he is so far beyond the pale that nothing is going to work for him. There is a trump card, so to speak, and that is the collective merit and covenant that God made with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And as the Ramak says, when you are mevaza a child, you are mevaza a parent. And since God does not want Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov to be shamed, Hashem will benefit their descendants, even if their descendants are not worthy of any other source of rachamim. Right? This is the well-known idea of, actually there are two lashonos that the Gemara uses, and it's not entirely clear. There is something called bris avos, the covenant, the promise that God made to the avos, and there is what is called zechus avos, the merit of the avos, that even when the covenant can no longer stand because we've breached our side of it, there is still a zechus avos. Now, I have to say that the pasuk in Micha seems to be referring much more to the bris avos rather than the general zechus avos, because it uses the phrase asher nishbata Lavoseinu. In other words, bris is a reference to the oath, to the shvuah that Hashem has made. That's called the bris. Bris and shvuah are kind of synonymous. Zechus is an idea that goes even beyond the bris avos. The Ramak is not medayak so much for whatever reason here between zechus avos and bris avos. He kind of mentions both of these ideas together. And the Ramak says this is a great, great segula for Am Yisrael, that even if I have nothing left on my side, I am a descendant of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And therefore, that will be a zechus for me. Now, the truth of the matter is, this is even going to be true if one is a ger, right? If one is a ger, although I'll raise an interesting question about this. A ger, of course, is not a biological descendant of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, unless their father is Jewish. Maybe on that part they have a descent. And yet we know that when a person is Magayer, a person gets the name Ben Avraham, right? Sometimes they even put Ben Avraham Basara. Okay, that's a separate thing. That tends to be more done in conservative movements, but Lamaisa, there's no reason why even a from Geiris couldn't say it. It's Emes, you're a Ben Avram Basara. But typically we write Ben Avram. And in fact, we actually say Ben Avram Avinu. By the way, just as a little aside, this raises some interesting halachic shilas. So let's assume that a person is a ger. So they're called up to the Torah by Ben Avraham Avinu. But what if they don't want to publicize so much that they're a ger? Again, nothing to be ashamed about. I mean, Mashiach comes from a ger, but whatever it is, they just want their privacy. So the halacha is they're allowed to be called up Ben Avraham. You can drop the Avinu, even though the kavanah is Avraham Avinu. In a kesuva or a get, however, you do have to be more complete and more exacting. So in the kesuva or the get, you actually put Ben Avraham Avinu, but for Aliyah the Torah, you can do Ben Avraham, and that's going to be fine. Now, the truth of the matter is, the requirement that a person should be called up Ben Avraham is even if they have a Jewish father. If they have a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother. So technically, they're not Jewish. Or they were not Jewish and they had to convert. So even though they have a Jewish father, halachically they're still Ben Avraham Avinu or Ben Avraham. But there too, if the father if the father is present and the father would be hurt, there are heterim for aliyas that you can even use the Jewish fathers. You can even use the Jewish father's name in order not to hurt somebody's feelings, because we're pretty makel. But again, once again, when it comes to a get or a kesuva, especially a get, but even a kesuva, we do have to be more medayik in this area. Now, this involves the person who is a non-Jewish person who converted, whose father is Jewish. Now, what about the other way around? This is an interesting question. What if you have a man with a Jewish mother, so he's Jewish, but his father is not Jewish? How do you call a person with a non-Jewish father to the Torah? Now, sometimes people assume you call him up Ben Avraham, but that's totally incorrect. Ben Avraham is only appropriate for a non-Jew who converted. Ben Avraham is not appropriate for somebody who was born Jewish. So what do you do? How do you call a person up with a non-Jewish father? So here there are different shittas. One shitta says you actually call him up by his mother's name. If his mother is a Jew, you actually say, Yitzchak ben Rivka, as it were. However, you can understand that might be a little embarrassing. Yitzchak ben Rivka, like whoever heard of being called up by your mother's name. Now there are, unless your mother is lucky enough to have, there are certain names that are not gender specific. For example, Yonah. Yonah is both a Hebrew man's name and a woman's name. Simcha is both a man's name and a woman's name. So if you're lucky enough to have a mother that has a name that is gender neutral, so you can do that. Other opinions say you can actually call up by your mother's father, who's Jewish. Let's assume your mother's father is Jewish. So if you're Yitzchak ben Rivka, and Rivka is the son of Moshe, so Moshe is your grandfather, Moshe is your maternal grandfather, you can be called up Yitzchak ben Moshe, based on the idea that B'nai Banim Arein Kabanim, that grandchildren are like children, and therefore you can go that way. Right? So again, if anyone has a particular shaila, they can ask whoever they ask their shailas to, in terms of how they would be called up. But the only thing is, Ben Avraham is not appropriate if your mother is Jewish. Ben Avraham is the name we give only to somebody who is a ger, meaning he was born from a non-Jewish mother and converted. Now, why do we call every ger by the name of Avraham? Because the emes is that, even though the person is not biologically Avram's child, but Avram had a mission in his life to teach godliness to the entire world. And therefore, anybody who embraces the teachings of Avraham Avinu is a true child of Avraham. You're not a child. When I say you, whoever the ger is not a biological child of Avraham, but the ger is a spiritual child of Avraham. In this connection, there's a beautiful, beautiful letter that the Rambam wrote. This was a letter that was written to a ger, whose name was Ovadja, same as the prophet. Ovadja Hager. And Ovadja Hager was told by his local rabbi that when he davens the Shemona Esrei, he is not allowed to say Elokeinu ve'elokei Lavoseinu. Our God, the God of our forefathers, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, because he is not a descendant of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and instead he should say, Elokeinu, he's our God, ve'elokei Avot Yisrael, and he is the God of the forefathers of Israel, but he should not say Avoseinu, he should not say our forefathers. Now the emesis, to give the rabbi a little bit of credit, the opinion he espouses is actually an opinion of one of the Tanoim in the Mishnah in Maseches Bikurim. So it's not, out of the way opinion. It is an opinion that is recorded. But the Rambam, and I would hate to be at the receiving end of this, the Rambam wrote a scathing attack to this rabbi. And he said this rabbi is transgressing all of the prohibitions of the Torah against being sensitive to the feeling of a ger. And he says, of course, a ger is a child of Abraham because he embraces the faith of Abraham. He embraces the teachings of Abraham. And therefore, he is a beloved child of the Avos of Am Yisrael, and he is a member of Am Yisrael. And how dare this rabbi denigrate this ger that has sacrificed so much to be Jewish. Remember, in those days, it was actually dangerous to convert to Judaism. This was during Islamic persecutions and the like, where you could be killed for it. Even today, by the way, if a Muslim wants to convert to Judaism in this part of the world, at least, there will be a fatwa. There will be, a death sentence on him. Although it's interesting, I don't want to get into this. Apparently, the son of the founder of Hamas, or one of the founders of Hamas, over many years, became an Israeli spy. Within, what's his name? Yeah, the Green Prince, right. And now, I don't know how he manages to stay alive. I mean, Baruch Hashem, he should be safe. He's in America. Yeah, but even so, And now he's making all sorts of speeches against Hamas and pro-Israel, and I understand that he converted to Christianity. Okay, good. But it's really, really interesting. Although I have to say, okay, I don't know, that the Gemara has a lashon that even by Rus, who was such a righteous convert, she had something of the Moabite that was still in her, because she made a reference that she's gleaning in Boaz's field and she follows the young men who are harvesting. Now Boaz told her specifically, follow the young women who are harvesting. And she said men, so it mentions that even Rus, who was a righteous tzaddikas, at least in her language, maybe not her behavior, had something. So I have to say, this Green Prince guy, which I really admire him. I mean, he's a tzaddik. He's mamish a tzaddik who is moser nefesh. I mean, he truly gives his life, or gave his life, risked his life day after day for the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael. So really, I mean, he is a ben olam haba, 100%. But sometimes he talks a little bit like Hamas. When he describes what Israel is going to do, he has a certain violent way of talking. So you see that a little bit of that Hamas sprach language is still in him, although Baruch Hashem, he turned it all to very good ways. So Ben Avraham, right? So this is very important. Now, so you may ask, so how does a ger have zechus avos? Very pashut. Because by spiritually becoming a Ben Avraham, by embracing Avraham's ways, so he gets the zechus of the bris avos as well. Although, I guess there may be a little. I have two questions on this paradigm of zechus avos. Number one, zechus avos is described in the pasuk Asher Nishbata Lavoseinu, that God swore to our forefathers. That seems to include Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Now, I don't know, does he get the benefit of Yitzchak, Yaakov? Apparently, the Rambam says, since he says, Elokeinu v'Elokei Lavoseinu, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, v'Elokei Yaakov, the Rambam's mashma'ut is that the ger gets these bris avos of all three avos. Even though in terms of his name, he's only a Ben Avraham. So that's an interesting point. But another point I have is this. So you're telling me, or I'm saying, or the Ramak is saying, that everybody, no matter how bad you are, you're still a ben Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and therefore you have zechus avos, you have bris avos, and I'm adding that even a ger has that. But here's my problem. What if you have a ger that Rachmana litzlan has a son who goes totally off the derech and is not worthy of any rachamim mitzad himself? Now here, how does that kid get the benefit of zechus avos? Meaning, if he's biologically a descendant of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, he gets the merit by virtue of biology. If he's the actual ger that embraced the faith of Avraham, he gets the zechus avos by virtue of the faith that he embraced. But if he is the child of somebody who embraced the faith of Avraham, but he himself does not embrace the faith of Avraham, so my question, I'm just thinking out loud, is my question, what zechus avos does he tap into? He can't tap into the biological zechus of being a descendant of Avraham because he's not. And he can't tap into the zechus of embracing the faith of Avraham because he doesn't. So, I understand the biological kid who's off the derech has zechus avos by virtue of biology. I understand the ger has zechus avos by virtue of his volitional embracing. But the child of the ger, and this would include grandchildren, I'm not sure where their zechus avos comes to unless we posit the following, that zechus avos itself may be a paradigm for something larger, meaning to say, even though the pasuk is referring to the zechus avos of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, maybe it's a general zechus avos. If I have a grandfather who was righteous, that's a zechus. In other words, maybe the kid of the ger who goes off the derech has zechus avos of his father. Now, it's a little bit of a... Now, actually, we commonly say that, by the way. We commonly talk about, oh, your grandfather was a big tzaddik, that's a zechus for you. We commonly say that, but Lamaisa, I don't see it in the Ramak's words. The Ramak does not directly invoke generic zechus avos, meaning your grandfather or whatever, or your father, or your mother. The Ramak invokes the zechus of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and Lianias Daiti, maybe there's a little bit of a kasha. How does the kid of a ger get the benefit of that zechus avos? But if we expand zechus avos to even refer to, my yichus, the tzaddikim in my background, then it could very well be that the kid's own father is the zechus avos that's going to protect him. Now, Lamaisa, I do recall, maybe it's a kasha on the Ramak a little bit, although not necessarily. Many of you remember, I'm sure you remember, the Gemara in the fourth parak of Brachas, when Rabban Gamliel was deposed as the Nasi. Remember a famous story, very interesting story, where he was Mavazeh Rav Yoshua more than once, and finally there's a palace revolt, and they vote him out of office, they impeach him. We don't really know the procedure of how that worked, but apparently he was removed from office, and they were debating who should replace him as the Nasi. So they didn't want to make Rabbi Yoshua the Nasi because that would have been rubbing salt in Rabbi Gamliel's wounds, that the very person he was opposing, should become his boss. So they didn't make Rabbi Yoshua the Nasi. Then they thought they would make Rabbi Akiva the Nasi. Rabbi Akiva was actually the greatest of the Chachamim, but he didn't have the position of Nasi. But it says Rabbi Akiva came from Gerim. Rabbi Akiva came from Gerim and didn't have zechus avos. So, because Rabbi Akiva had his own zechus, maybe he didn't need zechus avos, but for the position of Nasi, you needed an union of zechus avos. So actually, the Gemara actually says the child of a ger doesn't have zechus avos, but it may be limited to the particular context of Nasi. It may not be a universal. And finally, just to complete the story, you'll recall that the dark horse candidate that emerged was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, because he was both very learned. He was Dora Siri Me'ezra. He was a 10th generation from the great Ezra. Now there, by the way, I think you do see an interesting idea that Zechus Avos goes beyond the patriarchs, meaning you're using Ezra as a Zechus Avos, so that may lend support. And you'll remember he was only 18 years old, and people might not respect him. He looked so young, so his beard turned white, and that is when the Chachamim said, when he said about himself rather, behold, I am like a man who is 70 years old. I am like a man who is 70. He was actually only 18. The Arizal writes, or Rav Chaim Vital writes in the name of the Ari, that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was a Gilgal, was a reincarnation of Shmuel Hanavi. Shmuel Hanavi died at the very young age of 52. Amazing. So his neshama had been in this world for 52 years. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah got that neshama. So when he was 18, 52 plus 18 is 70, he had been on earth for 70 years. The Arizal says quite literally, behold, I am like a man of 70, because through Gilgal, his neshama had sojourned in his body for 70 years. Yeah.
So maybe it's cumulative from both angles. So if you identify with the avos of the past, you'll gain that benefit from them. And also if you have that direct chain going back through your forefathers, and the two can kind of come together. And so maybe it was to say that he lacked the proper, full expression of Sus Avos.
Right. You didn't have it complete. That's correct. Now here, though, I want to point out. So again, the Ramak's point basically is Zechus Avos sticks with us. Now, in terms of emulation, the Ramak says that we too, number one, have to look at every Jew, even if they're bad and they've done a lot of bad things, that nevertheless they are a ben Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and I don't want the Avos to be humiliated because of the way I treat their descendants, and therefore we bring out that midah of Hashem by the way we behave. Now here, though, it's interesting, the Balei Musar do apply it to other levels of Zechus Avos. They give a mashal. I know there are commentaries on Devorah that try to give you a mashal of how to apply it. So I'll tell you a mashal that I saw in one of the commentaries. But again, it's not a raya the Ramak would agree to it, but at least it's an interpretation. Where I gave a whole maisa about a Rosh Hashiva's son who had been embezzling money from the kollel of his own father's own yeshiva. And the question was, should they call the police? Should they do sorts of things? And they decided no, because this would greatly, certainly there has to be restitution. You can't simply compromise on that. But they decided they would not go public with it, because even though the son was a bum, the son was not worthy, but if you were to expose the son, you would bring deep shame and humiliation on the father, and therefore that's the midah of Asher Nishbata Lavoseinu. So at least in that case, you see this idea that the Zechus Avos. So it's interesting. It's not so much, you get the Zechus Avos. Rather, we care about the Avos. Therefore, we're not going to do something to you. Now, yeah.
Do we have to apply it to Christians and Muslims at least because they have the source of Abraham?
Say again, to who?
To Christians and Muslims?
Yeah. So let's think about this a little bit. We have Yishmael, right? Bnei Yishmael come from Avram, and Bnei Esav come from Yitzchak. So the question is, do they get the benefit of any inyan of Zechus Avos or Bris Avos? So B'Pashtus, the Gemara says that Yishmael is not nichlal as a child of Avraham, although he's descended from Avraham. And this is the meaning of the pasuk: Ki bi Yitzchak yikare lecha zara. It is through Yitzchak that your seed shall be proclaimed. And this statement is taken halachically to mean that Yishmael is not considered to be Zera Avram for any of the bris. Now, Yishmael does have his own merits. Yishmael has a zechus of bris milah and other things, but he doesn't have the merit of the bris that Hashem made with Avram. In fact, it's interesting, and Esav is excluded as well because ki be Yitzchak means from Yitzchak, meaning part of Yitzchak is your Zera. That's the Yaakov part and not the Esav part. So this is interesting. On the tefillos of Rosh Hashanah, there's a very interesting thing. You could even check it in the Art Scroll Machzor. The Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, we have Malchios, Zichronos, Shofar. So we have verses of kingship, remembrance, and shofar blowing, right? So at the end of Zichronos, the remembrance verses, we ask Hashem to remember the Akedah. Remember Avram Avinu's willingness to sacrifice his son. So it says in the Machzor as following: Akedas Yitzchak lezaro hayom tiskar. Remember the Akedah of Yitzchak to his descendants. Right. So it says in the Machzor, Akedas Yitzchak Lizarai Hayom Tiskar. So there's an alternative reading that changes the girsa a little bit. Instead of saying Akedas Yitzchak Lizaro, it says Akedas Yitzchak Lizaro Shel Yaakov. You hear the problem? Because if I say, Hashem, remember the Akedah to the descendants of Yitzchak, that could mean that Esav gets the benefit of the Akedah. So to be sure that that's not what we're saying, some people add, it's a girsa, that I'm not asking Hashem to remember the Akedah of Yitzchak to all of the children of Yitzchak, but only to the children of Yaakov. On the other hand, if you look in the Art Scroll, you will notice that the Art Scroll does not change the girsa, and the Art Scroll keeps Akedas Yitzchak Lizaro, because they say Esav is also not considered to be the child of Avram or Yitzchak, and therefore there's no need to qualify it with the Zaro Shel Yaakov. So if you look, so I think now that I remember, I think the Art Scroll doesn't even have the other gersa, because they normally don't like to put in parentheses. They like to give you a definitive answer. But if you look in most older machzorim, you'll see things in parentheses, and Lizaro Shel Yaakov will be in parentheses, etc. Yeah.
Wouldn't this exclusion of Ishmael and Esav only be for the bris and not for the zechus? In the context of the psukim, I think it's talking about exclusion from the prince.
I hear what you're saying, but it seems to be that they walk in tandem in the sense that once it has been determined that you're not Zerah, Abraham, so therefore you don't get any benefit. Again, Yishmael, we've spoken about this a number of times. Yishmael does have certain zechuyas, there's no question about it. But, as Brisi Akimis Yitzchak, that's going on the bris, and the zechus seems to be connected. But here I want to share with you one ha'ara of the Ramban that, to some degree, almost contradicts a little bit the Ramak's idea. Actually, maybe I'll save it tomorrow because it's a longer arichas. The Ramban, I'll tell you what the Ramban's question is. The Ramban raises the question that after the Ched HaEgel, when Moshe Rabbeinu was mispalel, after the Ched HaEgel, Moshe Rabbeinu has two arguments that he makes to God. Two arguments why Hashem should forgive Am Yisrael. One argument is, Lama Yomru Hagoyim, meaning to say, if you destroy Bnei Yisrael, the nations of the world say that you don't have the power to bring them to Canaan and fight the nations, and your name is desecrated. Right, so that's called Chilul Hashem, meaning you can't let them die because your name gets desecrated because they'll say you couldn't finish the job. And the second argument he makes is remember the covenant Exactly. Remember the covenant you made with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So Moshe Rabbeinu has two arguments with Hashem in the Chet HaEgel. One is Chilul Hashem, and the other is Bris Avos. It doesn't mean Zechus Avos so much, it's Bris Avos. Now after the Meraglim, Moshe Rabbeinu again has to pray, because even though Hashem wound up making us wander for 40 years, but his original plan was to wipe everybody out. And Moshe had to pray that shouldn't happen. But you'll notice that Moshe only invokes the Chilul Hashem argument again, meaning you can't wipe them out. If you wipe them out, the Goyim will say you didn't have the power to take them to Canaan and defeat the nations. But Moshe Rabbeinu does not invoke Bris Avos by the Meraglim. He only invokes Bris Avos by the Egel. He does not invoke Bris Avos by the Meraglim. Chilul Hashem he invokes. That's Chilul Hashem he invokes in both places. Right. So tomorrow we'll go over the Ramban and see that it may be a little bit of a kasha on the Ramak's Hanacha.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.